So to find out more, I reached out and asked Senator Ryan McDougle to join us to help us talk about what we might be able to expect during this upcoming special session. He represents Senate District 4. He's Republican Caucus Chair. He chairs the Rules Committee, and he's a member of Courts of Justice. So, Ryan, I appreciate you calling in, Senator.
Thank you for having me on, Mike.
Yep. Thanks for being here. You heard how I led into this. I spent some time in the last half hour talking about, obviously, what happened in Virginia Beach, a horrible incident, a horrible, tragic event. I've read some of the excerpts of folks that were, firsthand in there and were watching this as it was happening. It's simply heartbreaking. Your emotions have to go out to these folks, and I think all of us, you and I, any of us, can understand. Wow, if there's just something we could do that could prevent something like this. The governor, of course, took that opportunity to say, let's bring the General Assembly back in session. And we're reading about different bills that may be brought up. But the General Assembly has rules. And you being the chair of Rules Committee, I thought would probably be best to be able to help explain that so the folks will understand just what a special session would entail and how things would work. What can you tell us about what we can expect in a special session? And obviously, if you want to mention anything about the event last Friday, feel free.
Well, Mike, I think to start off, I just would like to say that all of us truly feel for the families and the grief and trauma that they are undergoing now. This is not something anybody expects to have to deal with. It is a horrible situation, and our hearts break for them. And it's kind of frustrating to me and disappointing that we are now having the conversation about a special session and the procedures and the policies we're going to undertake as we deal with legislation at the same time that these families are dealing so freshly with their grief and the change that their lives are going to undergo. We should have had the respect to let them deal with that grief, deal with that trauma before we've gotten to this next point. And it really is disappointing that the governor would come out as in a clearly politically motivated direction and call for the special session. But it's clearly not important enough for him to have a date when that special session would start, but he had to get it out there that we were going to do it. But I think for us to lose track of the families and what they're dealing with and their emotions and grief would be the wrong thing to do. So I did want to make sure we start with that.
Well, let me cut in on that for just one second, because one of the things we don't, well, it's not just one. There's a number of things we don't yet know. When you talk about calling a special session just so fresh after this incident, part of it is that emotional standpoint of it, and is it the right thing to do? The other is when you don't really even know the facts. We don't know much about this individual, this murderer. We certainly don't know motives at this point. And we don't know what we may or may not be able to address that actually could have an impact on that. That said, you got a special session ahead. There's legislation going to be presented, so carry it from there if you would.
Well, when we look at special sessions, they can be called by the governor. They can also be called by the legislature. But when the governor calls the special session, it sets a time for the General Assembly, the House, and the Senate to come back to meet. But the legislation goes through a similar process as to what we do during a regular session. The difference is, in a regular session, there is a very prescriptive time frame when bills have to be heard and addressed and voted on one way or the other. In a special session, we can set those rules for those time frames. But there are still some basic things that are in our Constitution, state Constitution, that don't go away. The fact that bills have to be read for 3 days in each body before they're voted on by the full body. In the Senate, we have a committee process. So the way a bill works is that an individual member would say, I want to introduce a piece or multiple pieces of legislation. They would file those with the clerk's office, and then under the Senate rules, we refer them to a committee to be heard. And that's the first step. A committee would meet, would hear testimony, would hear arguments, and then there would be a vote. Now, I've heard a lot of conversation about a willingness to get rid of that committee system and just take everything straight to the floor. If you are to do that in this situation, then I would expect that there are a multitude of bills on a multitude of subjects that people would want to eliminate that system and take things straight to the floor, which would, in essence, prevent us during a regular session of addressing the almost 3,000 different items that are introduced.
Well, this is actual rules, though. You have the rules.
Yeah, rules are important,
Absolutely.
and they allow us to have a process to be deliberative as we reflect on legislation. Not just the ones we might take up in a special session, but all legislation.
Well, this is something that, and you know, and in my brief time in the General Assembly, I sure saw my fair share of folks wanting to get on the floor, and essentially they're trying to get themselves on camera. That, you know, it's an election year, and so you want to be recorded saying something you can take back to your constituents. But who does that really serve? It's certainly not serving the issue at hand. It's not serving the constituents. It's essentially serving the legislators. So if you just let every piece of legislation on the floor, I don't know what the time limit would be that you have the debate and everybody trying to get there a couple of minutes on the camera. So clearly there's a reason for having a process with the rules that you've got.
Well, Mike, I don't know that many of your listeners understand this, but in Virginia, we're a part-time legislators. We are citizens. We all have real jobs. We go back to them. Our legislative session is either 60 or 45 days, and those are calendar days, not business days. So we do our work, and then we go back to being real people, real citizens. Unlike the federal government legislators, we are part-time. So if we were to change that system, it would also cause a real reevaluation of that. But as we work through this legislative process, when the governor calls us into session and we start that process, the legislature itself is going to decide what types of issues and topics that we're going to take up. The governor has certainly proposed his thoughts on what that special session would look like, but we are not limited to the governor's thoughts on items that we can take up that Virginians might think are very important. And as you talked about the process, it is always better for us to be reflective and deliberate when we're going through addressing legislation. And we've proven as Virginia legislators we can do it. I was the Senate patron of legislation after the horrible situation at Virginia Tech. We addressed the fact that if you have been involuntarily or voluntarily committed to a mental health facility, that you would have to be restored by a judge before you could legally purchase or possess a firearm. We took what the facts were, we looked at our law, and we came up with solutions, and I think those solutions made Virginia better. We need to do that in this situation. One of the things I continue to not hear coming out of the governor or the advocates for gun control is holding criminals accountable. We certainly passed legislation this year that would have held individuals who commit a second act of domestic violence accountable for their actions. We know that things like Project Exile, if you have a firearm while you're committing a felony, you do mandatory time in jail, are successful in keeping our streets safer. We need to be looking at those types of solutions to keeping Virginia safer. And I think that those are the types of discussions we will be having through this legislative process.
Well, so what kind of legislation, if any, have you seen so far? Has any actually been drafted, or is the process not allow that until the date of special session? Who ultimately draft legislation? What are you going to hear in committee? And am I right in saying that any such legislation will come through the courts of justice?
Well, the answer to your last question is under the Senate rules, courts of justice would get the legislation that's been talked about by the governor. Certainly, I think that we should be looking at mental health and behavioral health and what our systems are in place and what rules are, and if there are any areas that could have been helpful to avoid this type of situation. anything involving criminal sentences or firearms would go to the Senate Courts of Justice System Committee to be reviewed. But the process doesn't actually start in this case until the governor issues the writ calling for the special session, which is, as of last night, I had not received. So I don't think we have one at this point. Our legislative services team, which is lawyers that are on staff for the entire legislature, Republicans, Democrats, House, and Senate, have started to get requests, and I know that they are working on those requests, but nothing can be filed until that session goes into place. And then once the session actually starts, that's when the House and Senate will come together and establish the rules of procedure for the session. And that's a vote like any others, and will establish what those rules are and what types of bills will be considered during that special session. But those things have not occurred yet. But we've heard a lot about what people are talking about introducing, and many of those are things that were addressed or introduced in as recently as a couple months ago in this year's regular session. And that has been the focus of the conversation, of reintroducing some of that legislation. I have not heard of any other types of bills yet to be introduced, but certainly members can craft their own legislation with their own thoughts and ideas and their own support system. They can ask for the help of legislative services, but they can keep that confidential until they decide to introduce it, because they may or may not like the results of how that is crafted. So I do not have a good handle on what ultimately will be introduced. But I am fairly confident that as we go through this process, we will be looking at other things, specifically making sure that criminals are punished for crimes involving firearms as we go forward.
All right. I'm speaking with Senator Ryan McDougle, Senate District 4. He's GOP caucus chair. It's 7:19, about to be 7:20 a.m. Senator, can you hang on over a real quick break, and let me just follow up with just one of the concerns that I'm hearing from some of the citizens in my area?
Absolutely, Mike. My 7-year-old will be ecstatic to not get to school quite yet.
Okay, we'll be right back. This is Mike Watson speaking to Senator McDougle on the John Fredericks Radio Show. And welcome back. This is Mike Watson filling in for John Fredericks on the John Fredericks Radio Show at 7:22 a.m. And I'm speaking with Senator Ryan McDougle. He is the GOP caucus chair in the Virginia Senate, and sits on the Courts of Justice Committee, where it looks like just about any legislation, especially dealing with the gun issue itself, would come through that if and when this special session actually develops. Senator, appreciate you sticking around. I wanted to get to essentially just what the common citizen concern is. I'm like I said, I'm a member of a range, and I know some folks that have got a real concern that, look, we know this is an election year, we know this is an emotional time. We also know that a lot of the legislation that's being talked about really wouldn't have an impact on or could prevent actually what took place in Virginia Beach. How confident can these citizens be that with elections and someone not wanting to have their face on a flyer saying, hey, you did nothing, do you have just a gut feel after talking to your caucus or members of the General Assembly that we're actually going to be able to hold tight on protecting the rights of law-abiding citizens and really focus on if we're able to pass something that would actually have an impact on something like what happened last week?
Mike, the thing is, I talk to my colleagues, and both Senate and House colleagues, is real frustration and disappointment that instead of going through this time of grief and mourning and communities coming together, that we're actually having these conversations, that this is a political conversation that we're having instead of going through that emotional part that we should be dealing with. So I hear a lot of frustration from my colleagues and disappointment that the governor would have called this special session in such a political direction. I also hear from them of saying everything that has been discussed publicly by the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general are things that we've already voted on within a period of months, voted on and did not pass. And that also adds to the frustration. But I do hear my colleagues saying there are some things that we can address, and those things are holding criminals accountable for bad actions, holding criminals accountable when they have guns illegally. Taking those types of steps can have an impact, and we are going to have those types of conversations. So I would say to people, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't prognosticate the future, but I would look to the votes that we had during the last legislative session, scant 3.5, 4 months ago, and expect to see similar types of votes on those issues, but also look at the fact that we are going to bring up some issues that we've talked about dealing with holding criminals accountable, talked about with mental and behavioral health, and there might be a few other issues that we need to address to make sure that the life of Virginians are protected.
Well, you mentioned some of the legislation that has been voted on recently. I did see a few of the bills that were proposed. I know Senate Bill 1303, Senator Edwards carried, and it would have allowed municipal governing bodies to place additional restrictions when they were actually having in their chambers during a meeting. Obviously, that was not the case here in Virginia Beach. It wouldn't have done anything to affect that. Senate Bill 1446 from Senator Locke, essentially reinstating the no more than one gun in a 30-day period. Well, I understand this murderer bought one of the guns in 2016 and one of them in 2018. Obviously would have had no impact here. Senator Eben introduced SB 1748 about holding no more than 10 rounds of ammunition. But if you look at Virginia Beach already prohibits carrying any firearm. Virginia already prohibits carrying any loaded firearm with a magazine over 20 rounds in public areas in 13 different localities. One of those localities is already Virginia Beach. These are bills that make people think they're actually accomplishing something, but when you look at what impact they'd have on these horrible events, it just wouldn't have done anything to do it. And what I hope, I'm sure you hope, and what the public hopes is if we do something, make sure it's not just for the sake of doing something, but actually that'll have an impact on this. Any final words before we go to our break?
Well, I think you summed it up pretty well there, Mike. Make sure that the actions that we're taking legislatively would have an impact. But I think that us losing sight, seems one side only wants to have conversations about guns, not about individual behavior. And we need to hold behavior accountable, have those conversations as we go forward.
Well, Senator, I appreciate you coming on and helping to clarify this. I appreciate your time. Get that 7-year-old to school, and we'll hope to talk to you soon.